The room didn't feel like a hearing room that afternoon. It felt more like a stage where everyone knew something was about to happen, but no one could predict how it would end. The lights overhead were harsh, flattening faces, making every expression impossible to hide. Cameras lined the walls, red lights blinking steadily, each one hungry for a moment that could be replayed, clipped, and sent racing across the internet within minutes. Reporters murmured to one another, laptops open, fingers hovering above keys, waiting. At the center of it all sat Donald Trump, leaning back in his chair, arms relaxed. That familiar smirk resting comfortably on his face. It was the look of a man who believed he already owned the room before a single word was spoken. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett waited. She wasn't fidgeting. She wasn't scanning the room for attention. She sat upright, hands folded neatly, eyes forward, listening. To anyone not paying close attention, she might have seemed like just another lawmaker preparing to ask routine questions. But those who had watched her before knew better. They knew she didn't waste words. They knew she understood timing. And most importantly, they knew she understood power. How it shifted, how it cracked, and how silence could be just as sharp as speech. Trump had been talking for several minutes already, answering questions with the same rhythm he always used. Confident, dismissive, occasionally sarcastic, each answer felt less like a response and more like a performance aimed beyond the room, aimed at an audience watching somewhere else. He waved off concerns, deflected accountability, and leaned into that practiced bravado that had carried him through countless confrontations before. A few people nodded, a few smirked, some scribbled notes without looking up, already predicting the headlines they'd write. Then it was Crockett's turn. Trump glanced in her direction, his smile widening slightly, as if he'd already decided how this exchange would go. To him, this was familiar territory. Another question, another chance to dominate, another moment to remind everyone who he thought was in control. The smirk wasn't accidental. It was a signal, a message. He believed this was his moment, and she was simply part of the setup. Crockett adjusted her microphone just slightly, the faint scrape echoing through the room. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to draw a few eyes toward her. She took a breath, steady and unhurried. No rush, no nerves. The room settled, almost without realizing it. Even Trump stopped moving for a second, watching her with an expression that mixed amusement and impatience. She began calmly, her voice measured, not raised, not sharp. She referenced facts, timelines, statements Trump himself had made. Nothing explosive, nothing that sounded like an attack. On the surface, it felt procedural, even boring. Trump leaned back again, the smirk returning, as if to say, "This is it. This is what everyone was waiting for." But Crockett wasn't finished. She paused, just briefly, long enough for the room to feel it. Pauses do that. They create space. And in that space, attention rushes in. She looked directly at Trump now, not challengingly, not angrily, but steadily. The kind of look that doesn't flinch, the kind that signals intention. Trump chuckled softly, shaking his head, muttering something under his breath that didn't quite make it to the microphones. The smirk stayed. He thought he was ahead. He thought this was another exchange he could brush aside. Then Crockett delivered the line. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. There was no insult, no raised voice, no dramatic flourish. It was one sentence, clear and precise, framed so simply that it landed before anyone had time to brace for it. The words cut straight through the room, slicing past the noise, past the posturing, past the expectation that this would be just another forgettable moment. The effect was immediate. The murmurs stopped. Keyboards went silent. Even the cameras seemed to freeze for half a beat as operators instinctively tightened their shots. Trump's smirk faltered, just slightly, the corners of his mouth stiffening as his eyes narrowed. He didn't interrupt. He didn't laugh. For the first time since the exchange began, he didn't seem quite sure how to respond. Crockett didn't press forward. She didn't pile on. She didn't repeat herself. She let the sentence stand on its own, hanging in the air where everyone could feel its weight. That restraint mattered. It told the room she knew exactly what she'd done. It told them she didn't need to explain it. Trump shifted in his seat, leaning forward now, fingers tapping once against the table. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. The hesitation was subtle, but in a room trained to notice power dynamics, it was unmistakable. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't the script he was used to. A reporter in the front row glanced up from her laptop, eyes wide, then immediately started typing again. Faster this time. Another leaned toward his colleague, whispering something urgent. The line had already begun to spread. Not online yet, but in that pre-digital way, from person to person, through raised eyebrows and sharp inhales. Trump finally spoke, attempting to regain momentum, but the rhythm was off. His response sounded defensive, reactive, not commanding. The smirk tried to come back, but it didn't sit the same way. It looked thinner now, stretched. Crockett listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, as if she had already moved past the need to spar. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. One side had relied on volume and confidence, on the assumption of dominance. The other had waited, measured, and struck once, precisely, then stepped back. It wasn't about winning an argument in the traditional sense. It was about reframing the moment so completely that the balance of control shifted without anyone needing to announce it. By the time the exchange ended, everyone in the room knew what would lead the coverage. Not the smirk, not the bluster, not that single line, the one delivered calmly, without anger, without spectacle. But with perfect timing, Trump leaned back again, trying to reclaim his earlier posture, but something had changed. The room no longer felt like it belonged entirely to him. And as cameras continued to roll, capturing every second, it was clear that this wasn't just another viral clip in the making. It was a reminder of how quickly power can shift when confidence meets clarity, and when one sentence is placed exactly where it belongs. The moment didn't end when Crockett finished speaking. In many ways, that was when it truly began. Silence has a strange way of stretching time, and the silence that followed her sentence felt longer than it was. Not empty, not awkward, but loaded. It pressed against the walls of the room, against the cameras, against the people sitting there who suddenly realized they were witnessing a shift they couldn't quite name yet. Trump broke eye contact first, glancing down at the papers in front of him as if searching for something he'd misplaced. Though everyone knew it wasn't written there, Crockett remained still. She didn't smile, she didn't nod, she didn't look around to gauge reactions. She simply waited, her posture calm, her expression neutral, as if she had handed the room a fact rather than a challenge. That restraint mattered more than the words themselves. It denied Trump the confrontation he thrived on. It refused to escalate, and in doing so, it quietly exposed how dependent his presence was on noise. Trump cleared his throat and tried again. His voice came out firmer this time, louder, as if volume alone could reset the balance. He leaned into familiar phrases, dismissive language, broad claims meant to blur the specifics Crockett had just highlighted. To anyone half listening, it might have sounded convincing. But the room wasn't half listening anymore. It was fully awake. Reporters who had been casually typing now leaned closer to their screens. One producer in the back lifted her phone, already drafting a message to her newsroom. This wasn't just content. This was contrast. The kind editors loved because it told a story without needing much explanation. Calm versus bluster. Precision versus deflection. One line versus a flood of words. Trump gestured with his hands as he spoke, palms open, then chopping the air for emphasis. He smiled again, attempting to recover the ease he'd started with. But it felt forced now, like a mask slipping slightly out of alignment. He was reacting, not leading. And everyone in the room could sense the difference. Even if they couldn't yet articulate it, Crockett finally spoke again, but only to move on. She didn't revisit the line. She didn't repeat it for effect. She transitioned smoothly, asking her next question as if the previous moment had been merely a step, not the destination. That choice did something unexpected. It made the line feel even heavier, because she didn't need it anymore. It had already done its work. Trump answered, but his cadence never quite settled back into its earlier confidence. He talked longer than necessary, circling points, adding qualifiers, occasionally glancing toward Crockett to see if she'd interrupt. She didn't. She listened, head slightly tilted, eyes focused, absorbing everything. Silence, again, but this time it was strategic. It let him fill the space with more words than he intended. The audience in the room began to notice patterns. When Trump spoke, the energy scattered. When Crockett spoke, it narrowed. Attention focused. Even people who disagreed with her politically could feel it. This wasn't about sides in that moment. It was about control of the narrative. And control had shifted in a way that was hard to reverse. A senior correspondent near the aisle scribbled a note in the margin of his pad, underlining it twice. He wasn't writing quotes anymore. He was writing observations, tone, posture, reaction, the things that told a deeper story than transcripts ever could. He glanced up at Trump again, noticing the tension in his jaw, the way his foot tapped lightly against the floor. Trump laughed suddenly, a sharp sound that cut through his own sentence. It was meant to signal confidence, to brush off the exchange as trivial. But laughter without alignment feels hollow. It didn't invite the room in. It pushed it further away. A few aides shifted uncomfortably behind him, their expressions carefully neutral. Crockett asked another question, this one shorter, cleaner, almost surgical. No preamble, no unnecessary framing, just a direct request for clarity. Trump hesitated, then answered, but the hesitation was enough. Cameras caught it. Viewers would catch it later. Hesitation has a way of amplifying everything that came before it. The exchange moved on. Technically, other voices entered, other questions were asked, but the atmosphere never returned to what it had been. That one line sat beneath every subsequent moment like an undercurrent. Each time Trump spoke, it echoed faintly in the background, reframing his words whether he wanted it to or not. Crockett eventually leaned back in her chair, hands folded again, her role in the spotlight seemingly over, but the impact lingered. Reporters kept glancing at her, as if expecting another moment, another line. She offered none. She didn't need to. The absence reinforced the presence of what had already happened. When the session finally adjourned, people stood slowly, conversations breaking out in low voices. Laptops snapped shut, cameras powered down, but the energy stayed tight. A producer whispered, "That's the clip." Another nodded, already imagining the Chiron text, the push notification, the social media captions that would carry the moment far beyond the room. Trump stood and straightened his jacket, the smirk returning in a familiar shape, but it no longer commanded the same response. It felt like a reflex rather than a signal. Crockett gathered her papers quietly, exchanging a brief word with a colleague, her demeanor unchanged. Outside the room, in hallways and newsrooms and phones buzzing with alerts, the story began to take form. Not as a shouting match, not as chaos, but as a reminder that sometimes the sharpest blow isn't delivered with force, but with timing, restraint, and a sentence placed exactly where it can't be ignored. Trump walked down the hallway afterward, his steps measured but slightly uneven. The cameras still followed, reporters jostling to catch a final comment, a reaction, a glimpse of that signature energy he had relied on for so long. His smirk returned in patches, but there was a subtle tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there when he entered. Moments like these rarely left him unsettled, yet this one lingered differently. It wasn't just the room, it was the aftermath, the sense that someone else had just defined the narrative in a single, deliberate stroke. That someone was Jasmine Crockett. Inside the chamber where the exchange had occurred, reporters lingered, exchanging notes in quiet clusters. The initial shock of the line had faded, replaced by analysis. Phrases like control of the room and timing over volume were spoken under hushed breath, the kind that conveys both admiration and disbelief. Editors in nearby offices were already making decisions, highlighting which clips would go viral, which soundbites would dominate the evening broadcasts. It wasn't simply a question of policy anymore. It was about presence, perception, and strategy. Crockett walked through the same hallway. But unlike Trump, her pace was steady, unhurried. She didn't glance sideways at the cameras. She didn't tilt her head to see the reactions. Her focus was on the next moment, the next question, the next opportunity to demonstrate authority through composure rather than volume. The contrast between the two was almost cinematic. One actor still performing, trying to reclaim the stage. The other, moving with precision, deliberate, intentional, leaving an impression far stronger than noise could ever create. Inside the hearing room, the cameras continued to capture reactions. Trump's aides whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing toward the former president, noting the tension in his jaw, the slight flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. For years, they had witnessed him navigate confrontations with ease, his presence alone commanding attention, his voice bending the room to his rhythm. But Crockett's single line had undone that rhythm. It had shifted expectations. It had reminded everyone that power isn't only about dominance. It is about the moments you create, and the control you exert through clarity and restraint. Reporters began discussing the implications, already framing the narrative in real time. One veteran journalist who had seen countless exchanges like this muttered, "He's used to controlling the moment." But she just redefined it. Others nodded silently, fingers poised over keyboards. They weren't typing quotes. They were observing patterns, noting posture, timing, and the deliberate pacing that had made the line land so effectively. This wasn't just political theater. It was an illustration of strategic mastery in real time. Crockett's words resonated beyond the room. In offices, living rooms, and newsrooms across the country, people would replay the moment. They would share the line, discuss the contrast, and dissect the strategy. The power of the exchange wasn't in its volume or spectacle. It was in precision, in the ability to command attention without forcing it. This subtlety elevated her presence above the bluster, above the predictable rhythm of loud rebuttals and performative anger. It reminded viewers that leadership could be measured in poise and in the deliberate choice of when to speak and when to remain silent. Trump tried again, later in the session, attempting to steer the conversation back toward familiar territory, to regain narrative control. But each attempt was slightly off. His words, though forceful, lacked the weight and timing that Crockett had mastered effortlessly. The contrast between their approaches became increasingly apparent, one reliant on repetition and volume, the other on calculated restraint and timing. Even minor gestures, how she adjusted her notes, how she positioned herself, how she paused between questions, contributed to the perception that the room now belonged to her, at least temporarily. Observers noted that the subtle psychological play extended beyond the immediate exchange. Crockett's patience forced Trump into a reactive mode, shifting the onus of strategy onto him. Each statement he made now carried the risk of amplifying the contrast between his approach and hers. His natural inclination to dominate the room with energy and assertiveness now became a liability, highlighting her ability to direct the narrative without raising her voice. It was a textbook demonstration of power through restraint, a lesson in timing that few had expected to witness so publicly. As the session continued, Crockett maintained her rhythm. Her questions were concise, direct, and structured to draw out facts without sacrificing control. Trump's responses, by contrast, grew increasingly defensive. his attempts to dominate diluted by the very silence and focus Crockett had mastered. Observers, inside and outside the room, couldn't ignore the psychological dynamics unfolding, the power of calm and deliberate communication against the spectacle of volume and aggression. It was a lesson in narrative control that transcended politics. It was human psychology in action. The press captured every nuance. Laptops recorded the exchange, phones streamed it live, and cameras ensured no moment was lost. Social media, still buzzing with anticipation, would later magnify the impact of that single line. Clips would be shared, dissected, and repurposed, demonstrating the enduring influence of precise communication. In every frame, the visual contrast remained stark. One figure animated, reacting, reaching, pressing, while the other sat poised, deliberate, and resolute, transforming stillness into strategy. Even outside the immediate political arena, the lesson was evident. Leadership isn't measured only in words spoken, but in timing, presence, and the ability to allow one's message to land without interference. Crockett had demonstrated that momentarily silencing a room didn't require aggression. It required authority, preparation, and an understanding of human perception. The shift in energy within that room was a masterclass in communication, highlighting how strategic restraint can eclipse volume and spectacle. Even when facing someone known for dominating attention, by the time the session adjourned, the room felt different. The air, once thick with anticipation and expectation, had settled into an afterglow of respect and realization. Trump exited, still attempting to project confidence, but it was muted, a fraction of the force he had entered with. Crockett walked out with the same composure she had maintained throughout, leaving an impression that would linger far longer than the session itself. Cameras caught the contrast, editors emphasized it, and audiences across the country would soon experience the moment through the lens of viral clips and analysis. The narrative was clear. One line, delivered with precision, had shifted perception. It had demonstrated the power of composure over bluster, clarity over volume, and timing over reaction. In that space, the psychology of the exchange outweighed the specifics of any question or answer. Observers who might have focused on policy or procedure now focused on strategy and presence. Crockett's mastery of pause, timing, and framing had set a new standard, not just for the room in that moment, but for anyone paying attention to how influence could be wielded effectively without raising one's voice. The following moments in the session were almost cinematic in how they unfolded. Every glance, every pause, every minor adjustment became magnified under the scrutiny of cameras and reporters, who had now fully shifted their attention. Trump attempted to regain his rhythm, speaking faster, gesturing more emphatically, trying to create the energy he knew had served him well in countless other exchanges. Yet with each word, the contrast with Crockett grew sharper. His confidence, once natural and commanding, now felt performative, as if he were struggling to maintain control over a room that had already tilted toward her influence. Crockett, meanwhile, did nothing overt to dominate. Her voice remained calm, steady, and precise. She made eye contact, but only when necessary, letting her words resonate with their natural weight. The room responded instinctively. Journalists leaned forward, pens poised above notebooks, as if each word carried both a story and a lesson. It was a masterclass in timing and authority. How presence alone could command attention without forcing it. How one well-placed line could eclipse hours of speech. Trump's aides whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing toward him with subtle cues of unease. The room's energy was no longer dictated by his volume or gestures. The audience, once a passive observer, had become an active participant, sensing the dynamic and subtly aligning their focus with the one who spoke sparingly but deliberately. Each reaction, each murmur, each camera zoom, emphasized the psychological shift. Authority isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, measured, and precise. Crockett asked the follow-up question. Direct, but composed, referencing specific actions and outcomes. The phrasing was deliberate, designed not to provoke, but to clarify, to set a stage where facts met perception. Trump responded quickly, almost reflexively, but each answer felt reactive, each point slightly overextended. The contrast wasn't about the substance of their statements. It was about the rhythm, the framing, the psychological cadence. He relied on spectacle. She relied on strategy. He raised his voice. She remained measured. He gestured broadly. She used minimal movement, letting the words and timing speak for themselves. Reporters and observers began to frame the exchange in real time. One veteran correspondent whispered to a colleague, "Watch the rhythm. He's performing. She's directing." Others nodded silently, understanding the subtle shift. Cameras captured fleeting micro-expressions, Trump's smile flickering unevenly, his eyes darting briefly toward her as if calculating, reassessing. Crockett maintained a composed front, her gaze steady, her demeanor calm, almost unyielding. The energy of the room pivoted, creating a psychological narrative independent of the actual words being exchanged. Trump attempted humor, a tactic often effective in diffuse tension and redirecting focus. The laugh was sharp, attempting to draw attention, yet it landed hollow in the charged room. Crockett didn't react. The non-reaction amplified the impact of her earlier line. The silence between moments became a tool, an invisible force bending attention, highlighting mastery of perception and presence. Observers noticed that the more he attempted to reclaim dominance through volume, the more pronounced the contrast became. Even minor gestures added layers to the narrative. Crockett adjusted her papers minimally, a subtle movement that drew attention without distraction. She nodded briefly to herself, as if reaffirming clarity, not seeking approval. Trump, by contrast, leaned forward repeatedly, arms gesturing, fingers tapping, each movement intended to punctuate words, but instead, signaling unease. It was a vivid study in contrasts, each reinforcing the other, one overextending, the other restrained, one reactive, the other proactive, one loud, the other authoritative through silence. The press captured every nuance, understanding instinctively which moments would matter most for headlines and viral clips. Every angle, every frame, told the story of a shift in narrative control. In the background, aides adjusted notes, whispered reminders, all acutely aware that the optics had changed. The room, now almost a stage, demonstrated that power isn't purely measured by the words spoken, but by the timing, framing, and presence behind them. By the middle of the session, the contrast was undeniable. Trump's attempts to reclaim attention became almost performative, a repeated pattern of gesture, volume, and assertion. Crockett's responses were minimal yet effective, precise yet expansive, letting the psychological weight of her presence do the work that noise could never achieve. Observers noted that each pause, each measured glance, each deliberate choice in phrasing reinforced her control over the room. It was the difference between commanding attention and performing for it. A few moments of quiet conversation between journalists emphasized the lasting impact of her approach. One whispered to a colleague, "It's not just what she says, it's how she holds the room without saying more than necessary." Another reporter typed rapidly, capturing lines for context but also noting the broader lesson. Leadership and influence often transcend content. They live in cadence, timing, and composure. The psychological framing Crockett employed was subtle yet unmistakable, shaping perception in real time without overt confrontation. Trump attempted a final aggressive line, aiming for a rhetorical knockout, a moment that would traditionally shift focus back to him, but the effect was diminished. Crockett's earlier line had established a frame that no single rebuttal could erase. The room's focus remained aligned with her, a testament to strategic patience and deliberate clarity. Observers could feel it in the atmosphere. The room had shifted its allegiance, if only for a moment, toward the one who demonstrated measured command over instinctive reaction. Even after the session formally ended, the psychological echoes persisted. Editors and producers began planning coverage, social media managers started strategizing clips, and journalists compared notes on what had happened. Across offices and newsrooms, the emphasis wasn't on policy alone. It was on narrative control, contrast, and the subtle exercise of authority. Crockett's line had set the stage, and the ripple effects were immediate, profound, and undeniable. Crockett left the chamber quietly, composure intact, her steps deliberate, unhurried. Trump exited with energy that now seemed reactive, his body language signaling a subtle awareness that the room's dynamics had shifted. Cameras followed both, but the framing told a clear story. One had acted with calculated precision, the other with habitual instinct. Observers understood, reporters documented, and audiences soon would witness the power of restraint against performance. As the cameras followed them out, the contrast between Crockett and Trump remained stark. Trump, accustomed to being the center of attention, projected an energy that was larger than life, arms swinging, voice carrying, every gesture amplified by habit and expectation. But the room, the media, and the public had shifted their focus. The energy had been redefined, not by spectacle, but by subtlety, timing, and precision. Every step Crockett took reinforced what had already been established. Control isn't always loud. Sometimes it's deliberate, strategic, and almost imperceptible until you realize the impact. Back in the press room, reporters began debriefing each other quietly, yet with urgency. Notes were compared, headlines were drafted, and social media drafts were prepared. One journalist from New York murmured, "She didn't even need to raise her voice, and yet she owns this." Another nodded, typing rapidly, emphasizing the power of cadence and presence over volume. It wasn't just about what was said, it was about how the room, and by extension, the audience, was held in tension and then released with authority. The psychological resonance of Crockett's line continued to reverberate, amplifying her influence far beyond the immediate room. Trump's team, meanwhile, scrambled to adjust. There were whispered discussions, quick consultations, and small strategic pivots, all aimed at regaining narrative control. But the very attempts highlighted the underlying challenge. The energy had shifted, the contrast had been set, and the dynamic had been defined. Trump's habitual tools, volume, gestures, rapid-fire statements, were now being filtered through a lens he couldn't fully dominate. Every reactive move served as a reminder of the precision and intentionality of Crockett's approach. Crockett moved deliberately, walking through the hallways with poise, her presence commanding respect without demanding it. Her posture, rhythm, and timing reinforced a narrative that was simultaneously understated and unmistakable. Cameras captured the natural flow, while journalists' notebooks filled with observations about strategic pauses, the power of silence, and the subtle framing that turned ordinary statements into moments of authority. This was leadership in action, a study in contrasts, and a vivid demonstration that the room, like an audience, responds to calculated restraint. As she approached the exit, her demeanor remained consistent. No smiles, no gestures for effect, just measured movement and calm awareness. The simplicity of her actions magnified their impact. Presence does not require theatrics. It requires awareness, preparation, and the ability to let the audience engage with the message organically. Even those predisposed to disagree felt the weight of the moment. Influence, it seemed, was often less about being louder than the room and more about aligning yourself with the natural rhythm of attention. Trump, in contrast, attempted one final display as he moved toward the exit. A quick gesture, a forced chuckle, an attempt to reclaim dominance through body language and tone. The effort, however, appeared reactive rather than authoritative. Subtle cues betrayed tension, a flicker of doubt, a slight stiffness in the jaw, a hurried glance toward Crockett. The contrast between the two was a live illustration of psychology. In motion, one leveraging precision and restraint, the other relying on habitual performative dominance that now felt slightly out of sync with the room's new cadence. Even as they left, discussions in the hallways and adjacent offices continued. Reporters reflected on the exchange not merely for content, but for the broader lesson it provided. The observation was clear. Effective influence often arises from deliberate pacing, understanding timing, and knowing when silence speaks louder than words. Crockett had illustrated this principle in a way that transcended the immediate political exchange. It was a moment that would echo far beyond the event itself, shaping perceptions, headlines, and analysis for days to come. Social media, too, amplified the impact. Clips circulated rapidly, emphasizing the contrast between the two figures, one animated, reactive, attempting to dominate, the other calm, deliberate, commanding attention through strategic composure. Commentaries emerged, dissecting the rhythm, timing, and framing of Crockett's interventions. Analysts highlighted how a single well-placed line could reshape the narrative, not through aggression or spectacle, but through the deliberate exercise of authority. It was a vivid lesson in the psychology of perception, communication, and leadership. In offices and homes across the country, viewers noticed the difference. The energy of the exchange, the subtle cues, and the contrast in demeanor were all being discussed and shared. Crockett's line became a talking point not just for its content, but for its strategic execution. People recognized that her approach redefined the power dynamic, illustrating that leadership can be communicated without overt confrontation. It was a demonstration of control through poise, a lesson in the strategic use of silence, timing, and presence. Trump's attempts to redirect the narrative were noted, but they no longer carried the weight they might have in the past. The initial energy, so dependent on rapid engagement and dominance, was now filtered through the lens of Crockett's measured approach. Each response, each gesture, each word he spoke had to contend with the contrast she had established, a contrast that now defined audience perception and set the tone for subsequent coverage. It was a subtle, yet undeniable demonstration of influence, illustrating how one well-calculated intervention can shift the dynamics of an entire room. As the event wound down, journalists, analysts, and social media commentators began framing the story. Headlines were drafted, highlighting Crockett's strategic.com versus Trump's reactive energy. Analysts emphasized the psychological dimensions, noting how timing, pacing, and composure can outmaneuver aggression and spectacle. The narrative wasn't just about a single statement. It was about the enduring impact of deliberate presence, a principle that would be dissected and referenced far beyond the immediate political sphere. Crockett's ability to maintain focus and control over the moment exemplified a mastery of communication rarely seen in such public high-pressure environments. Her interventions were deliberate, precise, and carefully measured. Each question, pause, and line was chosen not merely for content, but for strategic impact. Observers saw that her mastery lay in understanding the rhythm of attention, leveraging contrast, and knowing when to act and when to allow the narrative to unfold organically. Trump, accustomed to commanding attention through volume and assertiveness, encountered the limitations of that approach in the face of deliberate, composed opposition. The juxtaposition became a visual and psychological lesson. Influence is not only a matter of energy, but of timing, precision, and the ability to craft moments that resonate beyond the immediate exchange. Crockett's single line had already created a lasting frame for the session. guiding perception and shaping the story before the day was even over. The final moments of the session crystallized everything that had unfolded. Crockett's composure remained unshaken, her voice steady, her gestures minimal, yet deliberate. Every movement, every pause, every carefully measured glance reinforced the authority she had established from the start. The room, still buzzing with anticipation and analysis, seemed to lean toward her without anyone consciously realizing it. This wasn't a performance seeking applause. It was an exercise in presence and timing, a demonstration that true influence often resides in what is unspoken as much as in what is said. Trump attempted a closing statement. One last push to reclaim dominance, to leave the room with his energy imprinted on the narrative. He spoke louder, faster, leaning into familiar patterns of performance that had historically served him well, yet the effect was diminished. The rhythm Crockett had established, the deliberate pauses, the strategic pacing, the weight of silence, filtered his words. The audience no longer responded as automatically to volume or spectacle. Instead, they absorbed the contrast she had created, evaluating the energy and impact of each phrase. Crockett's responses remained calm and deliberate. She addressed the key points without escalating tension, guiding the room's focus through precision rather than noise. Each line was crafted to reinforce clarity and authority, subtly directing perception and establishing narrative control. Observers could sense the underlying mastery. It wasn't about winning an argument in the traditional sense, but about shaping attention, framing the discourse, and demonstrating leadership through restraint. The press continued documenting, capturing both the verbal and nonverbal exchanges. Microexpressions, gestures, and posture became part of the story, highlighting the psychological dimensions of influence. Reporters whispered, comparing notes, emphasizing how a single, strategically placed line could eclipse hours of speech or hundreds of gestures. Crockett had demonstrated a principle often discussed but rarely witnessed in such a public, high-pressure environment. Control over the room derives from strategic clarity and timing, not volume or theatrics. Trump's attempts to punctuate his points with humor or emphasis were noted, but each effort highlighted the contrast rather than diminishing it. His energy, once commanding, now appeared reactive and slightly fragmented. The room's focus had shifted toward the measured presence of Crockett, and each attempt to reclaim attention only reinforced the narrative she had set. Observers, both inside the room and across media channels, understood the lesson. Authority and influence are most potent when exercised with precision, patience, and strategic timing. The exchange also highlighted the power of contrast. Trump's habitual assertiveness and reliance on spectacle stood in stark relief against Crockett's calm, deliberate approach. The difference was not merely stylistic. It shaped perception, influenced attention, and altered the narrative in real time. Audiences, whether present in the room or viewing from afar, were drawn to the subtle command she exerted over the interaction. Her approach demonstrated that influence often emerges from the strategic deployment of restraint and presence, rather than from overt displays of energy. Crockett's line, now widely circulated, became more than a moment, it became a reference point. Analysts dissected it for its timing, phrasing, and psychological impact. Media outlets highlighted it as a turning point in the session, emphasizing how one carefully chosen sentence could shift attention, redefine the narrative, and leave a lasting impression on both immediate observers and broader audiences. The lesson was clear. Mastery over communication is not merely about speaking loudly or forcefully, but about shaping perception through presence, pacing, and strategic restraint. As the session concluded, both figures exited, but the impact of the exchange lingered. Crockett's measured composure contrasted with Trump's reactive energy, leaving an indelible impression on journalists, observers, and viewers alike. Cameras captured the final movements, editors framed the narrative, and audiences began to digest the subtle dynamics that had unfolded. It was a vivid illustration of influence, demonstrating that leadership is often most effectively communicated through timing, clarity, and psychological insight rather than sheer volume. Post-session discussions reflected on the broader implications. Journalists analyzed how strategic communication could redirect attention, shape narratives, and establish authority without overt confrontation. Media experts highlighted how Crockett's measured presence had leveraged the room's energy, creating a lasting impact that would resonate in coverage, social media, and public discourse. Her approach exemplified a masterclass in communication, providing a model for leadership through presence, patience, and precision. Trump's team, observing the unfolding coverage, recognized the challenge of responding to such strategic restraint. Traditional methods of dominance, volume, assertiveness, rapid-fire statements, were less effective when juxtaposed against deliberate, measured authority. The contrast underscored a critical lesson. Influence is as much about perception and timing as it is about content. Crockett had demonstrated this principle, illustrating how one well-timed line could redefine the energy and focus of an entire room. The event's lasting impact extended beyond immediate headlines. Social media amplified the psychological contrast. highlighting the efficacy of strategic restraint versus performative dominance. Analysts discussed how measured communication could outperform aggressive spectacle, especially when delivered in high-stakes, highly visible environments. Crockett's approach became a case study in leadership, communication, and influence, demonstrating that authority is as much about how one delivers a message as what the message contains. Observers also noted the subtle visual cues that reinforced the impact. Crockett's posture, timing, and minimal gestures contrasted sharply with Trump's animated performance. The visual contrast amplified the psychological framing, making the effectiveness of her approach undeniable. Each pause, each careful glance, each precise line reinforced authority, demonstrating that presence and perception often outweigh volume and spectacle in defining influence. By the end of the day, the narrative was clear. One strategic, well-placed line had shifted the focus of the session, redirected attention, and created a lasting impression. The contrast between aggressive performance and deliberate, measured authority provided a vivid lesson in communication and leadership. Crockett had demonstrated how clarity, timing, and presence can redefine dynamics, influence perception, and leave a lasting impact on both immediate observers and broader audiences.